morning, everyone. I'd like to talk to you about how Asia needs to move beyond a prevention-only mindset. Let me start by asking you a question. Imagine that you are responsible for the security of your organization, and you can choose between prevention or detection and response. Which sounds better to you? I think to many organizations, prevention might sound better. It sounds easier. It sounds like there's less work. If I can just prevent it straight away, I have nothing left to do. I'm already finished. But there's a problem with that. And the problem is that no prevention is 100%. The problem is that there are always prevention failures. This is a representation of prevention failures. Each circle is a breach. The size of the circle is the size of the breach. Sometimes you'll see numbers, and the numbers are the number of records that were, or people that were impacted by that breach. We'll start in 2004 and move upwards and watch, as time progresses, how prevention failures have been increasing. You can see the circles increase, and by the time we reach 2017, you can't see where one breach begins and the other ends. Prevention failures are inevitable. There will always be a security gap. So when we talk about prevention or response, it's actually not a choice. The two are complementary. They work together for a stronger security posture. And FireEye has excellent capability, both in prevention and in response. This idea isn't a new idea. The idea that I need to anticipate a prevention failure. Sometimes it's called assuming that you are breached. 5 years ago, the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report said that security organizations are adopting an assume you're breached mentality, meaning that they are expecting prevention failures. They'll have capability to respond to those prevention failures. Authors have talked about how the military have been doing this for years. The word resilience comes to mind. What is resilience? Resilience is like a boxer. If the boxer dodges a punch, maybe they are fast, maybe they are agile, but it doesn't mean they're resilient. The resilient boxer can take a punch and still stand. And security needs to be the same way. We need to be able to take a prevention failure, because the prevention failure is coming. And we need to be able to respond to that prevention failure before there's any business impact. If you look at what the security analysts say the same thing. This is Gartner vice president. He says we must move away from trying to achieve the impossible perfect protection and instead invest in detection and response. It was about 2015 he said that. Just last month, March 2017, Gartner issued a press release from their newsroom saying that detection and response is the top security priority for organizations in 2017. Again, it doesn't mean replacing prevention. Prevention's still important, but prevention alone, a prevention-only mindset, lands you in the situation that we saw with all of those many breaches. You can look at what the technical experts say. This is Lee Holmes. He's the principal design engineer at Microsoft for PowerShell, a tool that is misused by attackers very often. He says you can focus harder against preventing breaches and defense in depth, but the enlightened approach is to assume the breach and to build muscle in detection and remediation. All of these industry experts are saying the same thing. Prevention alone is not enough. Then we can look at Admiral Mike Rogers. He's the director of the US Navy. He is the chief of the National Security Agency, the NSA, out of the United States, and he's the commander of US Cyber Command. He says, to be secure, you need to do two things. The first thing you need to do is keep intruders out of your network. Well, that's prevention. And the second thing you need to do is you need to identify when your prevention fails. You need to identify, contain, and eject them once they get inside. That means you should expect to fail at the first goal, which is to keep them out in the first place. He also says it's important to note that the tools and techniques you use for prevention are entirely different than the tools and processes you have for response. They're two separate capabilities. So don't think by having a strong prevention capability today that you immediately have a strong response capability. They're different, and you need both. So that brings us where we are today. Today, to be secure, you need to do two things. Keep attackers, and the key word here is attackers, not malware. Keep attackers out of your network with prevention. And secondly, kick out those persistent, sophisticated attackers who inevitably do get in, respond to prevention failures. That doesn't mean retaliate, that means respond. When we say respond, we mean stop that attacker who's inside your network before they can impact your organization. Now let's look at that attack sequence a little bit deeper. And Sandra talked on this from an intelligence perspective, but I want to bring it from a wider perspective. I think many of us know this, right? This is the Lockheed Martin kill chain. There's many stages to this kill chain, but if you look at them, they're all very malware focused. And there's some very, very important things that are missing in this kill chain. This kill chain helps you with a prevention model. It doesn't help so much with a response model. FireEye, we know, has investigated 200,000 hours worth of victim organizations every year. And in that investigation, we've learned some very important things that are not in that kill chain. The first is that we see attackers in networks who control machines. Sometimes those machines are controlled through malware, but other times they are not. In fact, 46% of the devices an attacker controls in a breached network have no malware on them. That means if you're only on a malware hunt, you're only solving half the problem. The second thing that Mandiant has seen is that in 100% of the cases that Mandiant has responded to, attackers always use stolen valid credentials every single time. That also is not in the kill chain. So we've adapted the kill chain a little bit, and we call it the attack lifecycle. And I want to walk you through the stages of the attack lifecycle and some interesting facts around them. The first stage is initial reconnaissance, where the attacker gains intelligence on you, the victim. They study your people on Facebook, on LinkedIn. They study your organization, and they identify targets. They then aim for initial compromise, where they break into the network. Now, initial compromise, 90% of the time, is done through spear phishing, almost always email. They then establish a foothold in the organization so that they can reliably connect back in. And this is where we differ from the kill chain, is the attacker will escalate privileges. They will steal those valid credentials. Attacker knows that an organization has many capabilities around stopping malware, but not so many capabilities around stopping a human attacker with stolen credentials. The quicker they can move away from malware and towards using stolen credentials, the less likely they are to be spotted, and the more likely they are to be successful. With those credentials, they map out the internal network, they do internal reconnaissance, they then move laterally, maintaining persistence along the way, and ultimately, they complete their mission. So that is the flow. This is very important because this is how you will be attacked. If you don't understand how you'll be attacked, how can you defend yourself? Where is the breach? The breach is here. It's in the second stage of the attack lifecycle, and the breach is instantaneous. Before the breach, the attacker is not inside your network. After the breach, the attacker is inside your network. And remember what we said about this stage. 90% of the time, initial compromise is done how? It's done through email. The machine that the attacker has access to is a machine that someone is reading email on. That means it's going to be a low-value asset, someone's laptop or desktop, because that is where we read email. on laptops or desktops. Unfortunately for the attacker, these low-value desktops do not contain critical information. The critical information lives on the server. So that means when you are breached, the attacker is here, but they want to be here. They have additional work to do to move from that low-value asset over to the server. Now, this is prevention. We are trying to prevent the attacker before they can come into the organization. After you are breached, this is when we say detection and response, or response. This is what we mean by response. We mean responding to a prevention failure where the attacker is now inside the network on a low-value machine, trying to move across the network to get to the server so they can complete the mission. The key insight to make there is that when you are breached, that is not the moment of business impact. The moment of business impact is here, where the attacker completes the mission. That means you have a second chance to stop the attacker before business impact. Prevention and response. They are not competing. They are complementary, and FireEye is excellent at both. We talked about dwell time. Dwell time, before you can respond, you need to notice that you have a prevention failure. Someone needs to notice. And in Asia, what was the number? 498 days to notice a prevention failure. It's much lower in the rest of the world. And the very bad news is that in Asia, the problem is getting worse, not better. It's taking organizations longer to notice they've had a prevention failure, not shorter. That is why a prevention-only mindset is something we need to move away from. We need to move to prevention and response. So we can bring that 490 days down to a much lower number. Now there's detection. This word detection is very confusing, and some vendors misuse it. Detection here means you're trying to detect the malware that you want to prevent. But detection here is talking about detecting a prevention failure. They're two totally different types of detection. They should be different words, but in fact, we use the same word. To be simple, I will just call it prevention and response. Prevention is really a malware problem, right? The things that come in through email, malicious attachments, malicious links, these are malware. But as we said, once the attacker has breached your network and is inside your network, they prefer to use the stolen credentials instead of malware. And this means that this problem is not a malware problem. It's a human attacker problem. It's a very different type of problem. This is what we refer to as north-south traffic, right? Your perimeter traffic is where the attacker is trying to gain initial compromise. But once they're inside, this becomes east-west traffic. We need to look at that in these later stages. In fact, the name for these stages, these are the infection stages, but you'll hear a term called post-exploitation stages. After your breach, these are the post-exploitation stages. And I'll talk more about those post-exploitation stages in a few slides. Endpoint EPP, Endpoint Protection Platform. This is your antivirus. What is EPP trying to do? It's trying to prevent malware. But there's another type of endpoint solution called EDR. What is EDR trying to do? It's trying to respond to the human attacker. Very different. Preventing malware, respond to the human. I see many companies who want to evaluate EDR solution, and they evaluate it by seeing how much malware it prevents. It's the wrong goal for an EDR solution. FireEye, we have a solution called FireEye Endpoint Security, which unifies EPP and EDR together. Then there's intelligence. Your tactical intelligence. This is intelligence like indicators of compromise. It's the things that you feed into your security devices so that they can prevent malware more effectively. But once the attacker is inside, as Sandra was saying, you need to know your enemy. You need to know their TTPs, their tools, tactics, and procedures, so that you can understand how they will move across these post-exploitation stages from the infected initial compromised laptop to the server, so that you can stop them more quickly and not have that long dwell time. And lastly, there's services. MSSP services are mainly focused on preventing and alerting, letting you know when you have a problem. But that problem only takes you up to this line. It's up to you to investigate and understand what's happening on these later stages. That investigation can be done with a new service called MDR, Managed Detection and Response. The job of that service is to, number one, notice quickly when you have a prevention failure. Number two, stop the attacker after you've been breached, but before the attacker completes the mission. So this is a good model for thinking about all the various aspects of security, and it's aligned to exactly how the threat actors attack. This is what we mean by intelligence-led. FireEye has capability across the entire life cycle, and throughout the event today, in the breakout sessions, you'll be hearing about FireEye capabilities across these various attack stages, and you'll be learning more about those features and functionality. Now let me ask you another question. Let's say you have a machine that is compromised, a machine that's breached. What is your reaction to that? Well, some might think, okay, we need to remediate the machine. We need to clean the machine, right? We need to quarantine the machine. But all of those answers are wrong. What you need to do is investigate the machine. What we see when a company is breached, it is never just one machine. In this case, a bank in Asia, we saw that the attacker had access to 96 systems. 26 of them were servers, 70 were workstations, and only 30 of them had malware. About a third only had malware. So when you see an alert come into your SOC and the alert points to one of these workstations, the goal shouldn't be, I need to clean this workstation. The goal should be, I need to understand where else the attacker is in my network. I need to scope the compromise, because the breach is never just one machine. Let's talk about the post-exploitation stages. These are the stages after the attacker has breached you, after they are in your network, but before you have suffered any business impact. The attacker still has work to do. And I want to start by asking you another question. If someone asks you, is this a weapon? How would you answer? Would you say yes? Would you say no? Or would you say it depends? It depends on how it's used. It could be a weapon, but it depends on how it's used. Well, that is the situation that security analysts are in all of the time in the post-exploitation stages. In the post-exploitation stages, remember that the attacker is not using malware. The attacker is misusing tools, just as you could misuse a hammer as a weapon. And what that means is these tools, normally they have valid uses, and they're in your network doing valid and productive things all the time. But you can't, and for that reason, you can't immediately block them. You have to look and investigate, how is this tool being used? Is it being used in a malicious way? And then address it. These are post-exploitation tools and frameworks. There are tool sets that attackers use for post-exploitation. PowerShell is part of the operating system. It's not malware. It's a tool. But attackers often misuse this tool in the post-exploitation stages of an attack. We talked about stolen credentials. There's entire frameworks. Empire post-exploitation framework is also built on PowerShell. There's Mimikatz credential tools, and there's Cobalt Strike, a red teaming framework for post-exploitation as well. So these tools are the tool sets that your attackers are using, and they look like hammers in your network. They look like normal, normal tools that administrators and users use, but these attackers misuse these for post-exploitation. FireEye, if you knew FireEye many years ago, in 2015, we were focused on the initial infection stages, right, with our NX and EX solutions. Today, in 2018, FireEye has capability across the entire attack lifecycle, including post-exploitation stages. And we just released our M-Trends report, our Mandiant M-Trends report yesterday. This is a report of all of the learnings that we have from our investigations of the victims of cyber attack. One very interesting number is that number of 498 days. It takes Asia 498 days to notice they've had a prevention failure. It's much too long. But there's another very interesting number in that M-Trends report. And that interesting number is where evidence comes from, aligned to these stages when we do an investigation. Right? So when we investigate the victim of a cyber attack, some of the evidence will come in this stage, some of the evidence comes in the initial compromise, and each stage has a different set of evidence. And we quantify what percentage of evidence comes from which stage. Well, I can tell you that in the initial infection stage, the initial compromise stage, is only responsible for about 7% of evidence. The post-exploitation stages, 93% of the evidence of a breach exists in these post-exploitation stages. What does that mean? That means if you have a prevention-only mindset and you're only trying to prevent initial compromise, you are 93% blind to the attack. Very interesting. Post-exploitation response is as critical, if not more important, than prevention for spotting evidence and for responding to a breach before there's any business impact. So how does FireEye address post-exploitation? Let me just go through a couple of quick examples. We have our endpoint security solution, which addresses post-exploitation. It's called HX. It is a unified solution that does signature-based antivirus, non-signature-based next-generation antivirus, and EDR capability all in one agent. We know that you don't want to deploy multiple agents enterprise-wide. We've consolidated that for you. The prevention capabilities as well as the response capabilities all in one solution. It has exploit prevention. So this is some of the exploits that APT37 has used. And these types of exploits are detected by FireEye Endpoint Security. This top exploit is a 0-day. FireEye Endpoint Security detected this 0-day out of the box with no tuning or configuration. This is the EDR GUI of FireEye Endpoint Security. You can see it's looking for exploits, it's looking for indicators of compromise. Here, it's found the post-exploitation toolkit, Mimikatz. And here, it sees Mimikatz being invoked through PowerShell. These are the hammers in your network. PowerShell, you can't alert on it every time. You can't block it every time because sometimes it's a valid tool. You need something smart enough to know when that tool is being used maliciously. FireEye Endpoint Security can help you with that. In the breakout sessions later today, you can learn much more about FireEye Endpoint Security. What about network security? FireEye Network Security also helps with post-exploitation stages of attack. Here are the stages, which should seem familiar. We have a solution called Smart Vision. Smart Vision is a feature of the product you all know very well as FireEye NX. NX always used to be about looking at north-south traffic, stopping initial compromise, and doing prevention. Now with Smart Vision, NX can also look at east-west traffic. And it's not just looking for malware, it's looking for human attacker evidence, and it's looking for post-exploitation activity in those later stages of the attack lifecycle. This is a screenshot of the Smart Vision interface. Here, what it's spotting is a pass the hash attack. And we do this by looking at and stringing together multiple events. SMB traffic, this is not malicious traffic. This is traffic that happens all the time on your network, but Smart Vision is smart enough to string these items together to realize it's a malicious event. Again, in the later breakout sessions, you'll learn more about the innovations FireEye has on NX as well as Smart Vision. And then the last example I want to give you is FireEye Helix, how FireEye Helix addresses post-exploitation. Helix is a security operations platform. If you don't know what security operations platform is, it's a convergence of SIM and analytics, case management, orchestration, and intelligence, all coming together to address post-exploitation stages of attack. This is a screenshot of the Helix GUI. In this screenshot, what's being done is we're seeing post-exploitation. We see a process being run called 7za.exe. This is essentially a compression archive. The attacker is compressing and encrypting data, getting ready to exfiltrate it or steal it out of the organization. We can see the command that the attacker, Helix reveals the command that the attacker has used to encrypt that data. Here's an interesting thought. Are you capable today to look at all of the command line arguments and parameters that happen enterprise-wide across your organization to spot things like this? What capability do you have today to inspect those command line processes and parameters? Helix lets you do that, and it lets you ask that question and get an answer extremely quickly, and to identify outliers, to identify problems in the post-exploitation stages of an attack. It's important when you compare security vendors that you not just look at features and functionality. You really have to understand the philosophy of the vendor that you're working with, because there are security vendors today that are only prevention-minded. They don't believe in the response portion of the attack. Let's look at some non-FireEye vendor quotes and see what we think about them. This is a quote from a vendor, and it says, "Effective security must operate under the assumption that the breach will happen and that it requires timely access to actionable intelligence, allowing you to respond and contain the breach before any damage is done." Does that sound right? Yes, I think so. I think that message from that vendor is spot on. Let's look at another message. By focusing on prevention, this security vendor reduces cybersecurity risk to a manageable degree. Does that sound right? No, I don't think so. By focusing on prevention, I'm only seeing 7% of the evidence of a full attack life cycle. That's not reducing my risk to a manageable degree. Today, I need both prevention and response, not prevention alone. Let's look at one last one. Don't just be a security monitor, prevent breaches before they strike. Well, this vendor is playing on words again. They're saying monitoring is bad. Of course, it's better to prevent than detect malware, but we need to also monitor for prevention failures, right? Unless you believe that your prevention's 100%, and I don't think any vendor would say they have a solution that has 100% prevention efficacy. So in closing, I want to close with a quote from our CEO, Kevin. He says, "Your goal as security professionals should be to deliver the outcome that if you do get compromised, you eliminate the impact. And that's possible operationally." And I think that's a great quote. It's not about stopping the breach, because you can stop the breach sometimes, but you can't stop the breach every time. If, in addition to your prevention capability, you have a response capability to address the post-exploitation stages of the attack life cycle, maybe the breach happens, but you can stop the impact, the consequences of the breach. And that's really what the businesses, the business leaders, and the boards of directors really care about. Thank you very much.